Welcome to Bullshift, the podcast. My name is John DeGuy. I'm the host of the podcast and the author of the book Bullshift. This is a podcast where we talk about behavioral finance in general and specifically about how the financial services industry shifts your attention to get you to feel more bullish. Welcome. My guest this week is Preet Banerjee. Preet is a recent PhD graduate, but also a prolific writer and author, a consultant to the financial services industry, and a person who's probably a household name for people listening. So, Preet, it's a real pleasure to have you on. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, John. Just one quick correction off the top. It's technically not a PhD, it's a doctorate of business administration. And for the listeners, the main difference is, if I could boil it down very simply, is a PhD is more of a theoretical, and a doctorate of business administration is a bit more practical in its research. But thank you very much for the introduction, regardless.
Well, it's interesting that you should say that because a lot of what you've done over the course of your career has been focused on actually making things practical and finding actionable solutions to real world problems rather than just theoretical ones. And so there's the old joke that the difference between theory and practice is that in theory there is no difference, but in practice there is.
I use that one often, actually.
So let's begin there. Let's begin by talking about your thesis and the work you've done, the research you've done, because it's pretty groundbreaking and it deals with financial advice and the value of financial advice in Canada. Maybe you could take a few moments to walk us through it.
Yeah, and I'll offer to anyone who is interested, if you want to read the entire thing, you can send me an email, go to my website. I'm happy to send you the entire thing. There's no way we could do it justice in half an hour.
Right.
But the Coles notes of it are as follows. The question I was interested in answering is, what is the value of financial advice? Which sounds like a very trivial question, but from being in the industry, I would say on both sides, having been an advisor at one point and being an advocate for financial consumers as well, I think I benefit from seeing both sides of the question. And one of the things that I could never really reconcile was the fact that I know that there is a lot of what I'll call dead wood in the industry. And I don't think that's really a secret to anyone inside or outside of the industry. There's some people who should not be licensed to give financial advice because the consumer basically assumes anyone sitting across from them that calls themselves a financial advisor or any derivation of that title is acting in their best interest. I think that is the default expectation because it's held out as a profession like a medical doctor and whatnot, due to branding and so on. And that's not really the case. And so I do know that there's a lot of people who should not be financial advisors. And I also, at the same time, know that there's a lot of people that I'd be happy to recommend my parents to. And so there's a huge variation in quality within the industry. And yet, when you look at the rhetoric, it tends to be very black and white in how it looks at this question. There are some people who are firmly in the camp that all financial advisors should be shot out of a cannon, and then you've got people who are very pro advice, and there's not really a lot of nuance. And that just didn't make sense from what I was seeing. It's just not that black and white. And so what I wanted to do was try to explain, well, why is there this disconnect? How can it be possible that I know some people who are very passionate and intelligent who are on either sides of that spectrum? And so that was the reason for looking into this question. And to give you some historical context, one of the things that made it challenging was the nature of contemporary financial advice has evolved over time. It used to be the case that being a financial advisor was synonymous with just transactional advice on individual securities. If you fast forward to May 1st, 1975, we're going back in history now, but we go fast forward to May 1st, 1975. This is known as May Day in the industry. And this is when the SEC in the United States deregulated trading commissions. And up until that point, which is kind of ironic, but up until that point, no matter where you went, trading commission schedules were the same up and down the street. There was no real competition, which is ironic because the United States is kind of the poster child of free markets and capitalism, and the stock market is probably the most symbolic thing of free markets and capitalism. And it was highly, highly regulated, very little price competition. So May 1st, 1975, that all changed. And everyone thought this is going to be the death of the financial advisor because now there's going to be a race to zero with commissions. You're going to have discount brokerage accounts. being set up and people can bypass that middle person. And instead, what happened was the advice industry adapted and they shifted from individual securities transactions to portfolio management. But then the last, and that was back in the 70s and 80s. And in the last 20 years, there has been a slow shift towards getting away from portfolio centricity and getting more towards planning centricity. And so, in terms of measuring the value of financial advice, you have to take into account that what is being offered by the financial advice industry has also been changing. So, that's been one of the challenges when you look at some of the literature. You have academic literature and you have industry literature, practitioner literature. And I think one of the common gaps in the literature that had been identified was that A, there's no real theory of what financial advice is supposed to be.
Mhm.
And that, most of the measures of the value of a financial advisor have been portfolio centric, which is fine. There's a lot of great information that has been gleaned from that. But in terms of trying to quantify what is the value of financial advice to households, it's really just part of the picture. So taking a giant step back and trying to break it down as simply as possible, there's two things that I really wanted to accomplish with this research. The first is differentiating the market for financial advice into the different channels of advice that are available, to try to recognize the fact that not all financial advice is the same and there's different types of financial advice providers, so controlling for that. And then in terms of measuring the outcome, coming up with not only a portfolio centric measure, sort of a well established one, which is level of assets that people have, but also some non portfolio centric measures of outcomes that are more reflective of some of the other things that good holistic financial advice or contemporary advice is bringing to the table. And that is the breadth of advice. So some channels offer advice on, seven, eight, nine, 10 different facets of people's household financial decision making. And then a third one was it was a comprehensive measure of financial confidence. And this was brought on because some of the literature has basically said, hey, look, people are paying for advice. They're underperforming a counterfactual portfolio. We can get into that in more detail, but they're not even getting what is available. And that drag in performance is greater than the cost of advice. So there's a net negative to some households. So why would someone choose to do this in light of this information? And their hypothesis was that there are intangible benefits of financial advice, such as emotional benefits and behavioral benefits that must exist. Now, they didn't say what exactly those were, but it was an avenue of research to explore. So, differentiating the channels of advice that are available, and then taking a look at multiple outcome measures to try and answer this question as to what is the value of financial advice. And the answer is it depends.
Well, maybe I can just interject very quickly to say, I think I and a lot of other people owe you a debt of gratitude because in my previous books, I've talked about this dichotomy of how financial advice is by no means monolithic. It's nuanced. There's a wide variety of good, bad, and otherwise. And I have over the years endured some battle scars because in trying to point out what I see are problems, people think that I'm pointing out the negatives, but I'm with you. I think there are a lot of excellent advisors, and I certainly do not cast aspersions on their intent. They're virtually all advisors are people who have good intentions. They want to do good things. There are different levels of qualification and different levels of diligence and what have you. And people sometimes don't know what they don't know, so they can't even correct problems because they haven't identified them as problems in the first place. So it's not a problem of anyone trying to be sneaky or anything like that. It's a people sometimes just don't know what they don't know, and consumers have a very very hard time uh, sussing through the good ones and the not so good ones because the whole reason they're going to someone for advice in the first place is that they don't feel qualified to do it. And as you say, they're presumptively on board with whoever they get. Well, that person must know because right. So
Yeah,
let's
and that.
then.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, no. If you make your comment first, and then I've got another question. So let's go.
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to point out the fact that, I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the whole promise of financial advice is that is a substitute for financial literacy. And so you could say that about any service. If you can't do it yourself, you hire someone to do it for you. So implicitly, that is the promise of financial advice. And some research as part of my literature review, what I actually found was, if you were to create a sort of a two-dimensional grid and you look at highly financially capable households who are also highly financially literate, there's a double positive for them. They get a lot more out of the financial services for two reasons. They have access to better quality advisors who set, asset minimums, and they've been in the business for a long time and what have you. So you could argue that that is likely correlated with higher competence or some kind of determinants of success that explains why they're still in business that long and managing a lot of money. And then 2, because they are more highly financially literate, they are able to get more out of those relationships. Qualitatively, the nature of those relationships is different because the advisor knows that this person knows a little bit, so they have to bring their A game. They're going to be more questioning, more critical of the advice received, and so again, the quality of that nature, that relationship is different. If you look at the opposite end of that two-dimensional spectrum, look
Right.
at households that have not a lot of assets and they don't have a lot of financial literacy as well, then in those cases, you don't even have access to arguably the better pool of financial advice providers. And second, this is the quadrant where financial advice is supposed to be a substitute for financial literacy. And what a few papers found is that it's in fact an opportunity for the service providers to take advantage of them because of that lack of
Right.
financial literacy because they're not as discerning.
Right. Let's move then from the concept of financial literacy to the first cousin, which is financial planning. And one of the things that your research showed was that financial planning seems to add value. It's one of those ancillary things that helps. You run a company, Money Gaps, that does what's so-called light financial planning. And could you weigh in on your thoughts? Because I don't know if there's research that actually supports one or the other. Is there a continuum where light financial planning trumps no financial planning and comprehensive financial planning trumps light financial planning? Or is it one of those things where different people, different strokes for different folks, and if you're not going to do the comprehensive plan, then a light financial overview is better than nothing, and at least it allows you to identify blind spots and so forth. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, the answer is it depends. And so,
Again,
yeah, I think there's some cases where sort of light planning, I don't even know if it's the right word 'cause it's not really planning what Money Gaps does. It's more of a holistic scorecard to help people identify their money gaps, if you will. And then hopefully that leads to some planning engagement with the advisors. But planning, as you know, is an ongoing process, monitoring, review, goal setting. So it's not just a financial plan is not the end of financial planning. It's the beginning, and it's the beginning of all those calculations becoming more and more stale and wrong as time goes on, which is why it's an ongoing process because everything changes. But for some people, I think a light approach is kind of like a gateway drug, hopefully, to a more in-depth approach down the road. But it's not like, and you can maybe attest to this more than I could, it's not like people bang down your door and say, "I need a 75-page financial plan stat," right? That
right,
rarely happens unless there's some kind of significant money milestone or event that's happening that requires them to sit down and say, "I need to take this seriously. I need some advice," whether it's sale of a business, they're about to retire or thinking about it for the first time, they've received in here. Something happens that triggers the need to do sort of a more full assessment and engage in a more deeper process. So, it really depends. So, I would say for the mass market, do they need a full comprehensive financial plan? Probably not. It's pretty rare that you're going to need something super comprehensive. If anything, you're just trying to make things work today and hopefully be in a position that down the road, when it comes time where making a full financial plan makes more sense, you can do that. So maybe more compartmentalized when you have a less complex household situation, which most people do. I mean, households with lots of assets or complex financial situations, because you can require planning without having a lot of financial assets. Tougher to get advice because there's not a lot of models that suit that super well right now. It's growing, but um, yeah, it again, in the end, it really depends on the situation. So, I think what I'm sort of leaning towards, and one of the big takeaways for me from the research was we're failing the mass market when it comes to getting good financial advice. And really, better financial advice is being more holistic and not just focusing on products.
right. This brings me to the meat and potatoes part of what I wanted to talk to you about today. And that is the industry does a good game. A lot of what happens and a lot of what I lament in bullshift is the industry says things that are presumptively true and sometimes true, but not necessarily because the industry is by no means homogenous. And that comes down to the value of advice, specifically with regard to behavioral coaching, but it can take many forms. So I have seen at least three firms, and maybe even there may be two or three others as well that have done independent research. They'll call it research. I'm not so sure that that's actually the way would be qualified. That shows the value of advice is somewhere typically between 2 and 4% of added value. And it's interesting because usually the cost of advice is one or maybe a little over 1%. And so it seems to be that the value of advice is somewhere like the 2 to 3 and a half times the cost of advice. And that's a good intuitive people sort of say, I would be happy to get this if I could get more value out of it than I put in it in terms of cost. The thing that I find is that when you look at the individual studies that try to quantify the value of advice, they get to similar numbers. They have the same destination, but the path they take in terms of the various factor inputs that add the value are radically different in terms of how they are quantified. And sometimes they are massive factor inputs for one study and totally non existent in another study. And if these studies are truly robust, I would expect the numbers to be similar. So please, what are your thoughts on companies that put out papers that say the value of advice is X?
Well, in terms of my opinions on those companies, maybe I'll couch it in terms of my opinions on some of those studies,
Right,
because I think it's that is kind of part and parcel. If you're in the industry, you're putting out content, you got to speak to the value of advice. So that I think that is par for the course. But in terms of what they're putting out there, I agree that in the aggregate they're probably directionally correct along most lines. I think a lot of that kind of is in line with a lot of people what they think about in terms of where value is in terms like financial planning, tax management, all this stuff. But when it comes down to you know, isolating the value of this component of the advice that an advisor provides with respect to tax planning is worth whatever they say, 75 basis points annualized. How do you come up with that number? Um, and given the disparity in tax planning opportunities for different households, it's it seems a bit of a stretch to really quantify it down to even a whole number, let alone going down to, one or two decimal places, right? Like, how do you get that specific? Um, I would I don't even know if that's really possible given the so many factors that are involved in what a financial advice provider can do for a household. So I feel like that I think would fall under bullshit, for sure.
right,
And the problem is, you know, they may actually end up being right about, again, the direction. The methodologies, I think, are questionable. And I think this actually damages the credibility when you put out stuff like this and it is based on more conceptual models as opposed to being able to truly identify what is the causational impact on households. Because one of the things that I looked at, and the literature is rife with this, is endogeneity plays a huge role in how well people do. And it could be the case that someone who is highly educated, high financial literacy, high interest in personal finance, high income, high level of assets before they start with their most recent financial advisor, it may be the case that all the reasons that explain why they're an attractive client to someone in the industry in the first place are the same reasons that are going to explain why they end up doing better than everyone else. Maybe they end up making better decisions than other people, including when to know when to look for advice, how to get more out of those advice relationships. And so, in cases like that, and I can certainly say this from my experience when I was an advisor. There's some people that walk into your office or you had that first meeting, you're thinking, I am super jealous at how much you've done on your own already.
right.
And it's a privilege to take you on as a client because you already understand everything and I'm just helping with implementation. So who's really responsible for how well or the trajectory change in that person's wealth? And so, that's another thing that I don't think might be captured in some of those studies. It could be that, let's even say that those numbers are accurate to 2 decimal places. Maybe the reason that they're getting so much lift, as it were, is actually more because of them and their ability to get more out of financial advice. So that endogeneity component is a big one. And I think some of those studies maybe don't properly account for that.
So I'll give you an example of the indigeneity, the way an ordinary person can understand this. If the advisor, if the client is a simple meat and potatoes high earner, but doesn't have a lot of assets and can only afford to put aside, let's say, $2,000 a month, and it goes into an RSP. $2,000 a month into your RSP is the sort of thing that the client might have done whether they had an advisor or not. And if you're going to say, well, that's tax optimization because you put it into an RSP as opposed to a taxable account, all of that is true. But if you think about the counterfactual of, well, what would this person have done if they didn't have an advisor? They would have put the same, and in fact, maybe in fact before they hired an advisor, what were they doing as a base case? What were they doing before they hired the advisor? And they were putting $2,000 a month into an RSP. Well, the advisor then says, "Well, I've given you the advice. The advice is to put $2,000 a month, have a regular monthly savings program, pay yourself first, put it into your RSP, get the tax deduction." Except that I don't know how you can claim that there's a quantifiable amount of value added because the behavior didn't change. That's just that what the client is doing, putting $2,000 a month into an RSP, is identical to what he or she was before he or she met the advisor. The advisor is giving good advice. The client is taking it. It has a tangible value, but it didn't move the needle in terms of actual behavior. The conduct of the client was unchanged. And if that's the case, could that advisor claim to have done X, Y, Z to have added a certain amount of value, or are they just staying the course because of the endogeneity of the pre-existing condition?
Yeah, and I think it's a good example. And I think some people will jump on that and say, "Oh, you're saying that financial advisors offer less value?" And I would say, I think that's the wrong question to be asking. In any case, if there are some people who are more delegators and they say, "Here's what I got. This is what I need to be done, and I've chosen you because I like working with you," there is value in that, but don't sort of sell it as I've changed your life, right? That's,
Right.
I think, the difference with all these studies trying to lump people into one sort of homogenous group and saying, on average, tax planning is worth, 50 basis points annualized per year, or estate planning is, annualizing that. I mean, there's just too much to know to be able to quantify that down to a number. And I'll have to give credit to our friend Jason Pereira for mentioning, the absurdity of going down to 2 decimal points when trying to estimate some of these individual value adds. It just seems very specious.
Yeah. And that is part of what I'm trying to do with Bullshift is I'm not trying to slag the industry. I'm trying to get people to be a little less accepting of the speciousness of the arguments that are being put forward in the first place and the presumptive granularity of those arguments. I'm with you. I'm intuitively inclined to believe that they are directionally correct, and I'm intuitively favorable toward the industry and what it hopes to do and what it usually does. But if you're going to try to be fancy about what you are taking credit for and making it sound like it's really robust and so forth, that's when I start going, come on, you're starting to bullshit me now. Like this is
Yeah,
not
and
really that credible.
to be clear, I'm also not saying that there isn't deadwood in the industry. I
Yeah, yeah,
remember in my rookie school, after everyone just passed the initial exam to get licensed to manage people's life savings, which took an all, I don't know, 2 weeks of self study. I remember someone bragging about getting a 60%, which was the pass mark, bragging about that. And I thought, what an odd thing to brag about. And that was an eye opening experience on day one in the industry. There is across the board to not a high caliber across the board. Again, there are some people who are amazing, right? And I would have
mhm,
no hesitation whatsoever to say, you need to talk to this person. They're going to set you in the right direction. I have no reservations about it whatsoever. But I don't know what the number is, 25%, 30%, you could probably do without. And I think
Right,
people would be better off.
right. Maybe we could have a quick discussion about where the line should be drawn, because of the endogeneity. One way of doing it is by account size, and the industry struggles because in many ways the people who oftentimes need the most advice because they're not um, able to self-assess their own what they know or don't know, and they don't know what they don't know, and they need direction. But part of what, and I don't know which is the cart and which is the horse, but they need direction and they don't have assets. And if they had assets, maybe they would have more direction. If they had direction, they would maybe have more assets. Is there a dollar amount that you think would be a reasonable threshold where, uh, setting aside the Henrys, high earners, no, not rich yet, the 27-year-old person who just started practicing medicine, who went by the time she's 60 will be a multimillionaire because her medical practice will have grown and she will have made all this money. But an ordinary person who uh, let's say is 30 years old and is now secure in his or her career and making 85,000 dollars a year, a strong earner, but not wealthy, but strongly in the middle class, and now wants to set up a regular savings program, but has very little by way of savings on day one. How can we give good advice and good service to good people who need advice and are receptive to learning when they come to the table with relatively few assets to begin with?
Yeah, so I think this is as an example of how overall financial services has been failing the mass market and tackling this particular demographic that you're talking about. They're turning to social media for better or worse, and
Sure.
so there is a lot of great information on social media for sure, but there's also a lot of garbage out there. And the problem is, if you are, being introduced to this world for the first time, it's a long time before you can even figure out what is the good and what is the bad. And some people may never make that distinction because they get pulled into sort of the dark side of, like
Right.
let's say a Wall Street bets community on Reddit, which is all about swinging for the fences and society be damned. We're disenfranchised. What do we have to lose? And that's not really a good thing to do early on in your life. And so in terms of a dollar amount, I don't know if a dollar amount is the right sort of framework to look at it. I think that there is a model of advice that has yet to be fully explored that may make better sense than what is currently available. So, for example, I know some people say, well, what about robo advisors and being able to do it yourself? Well, not everyone wants to do it themselves. So, I think a lot of people outside of the bubble may not realize, or maybe a lot of people inside the bubble may not realize that there's a huge amount of people who are so intimidated by the idea of even placing a trade. That's just not a non starter, especially for their first time investing. Then we have robo advisors, which requires someone to have the self selection into that channel, as well as a bit of confidence. But if we take a look at what some of the newer social media content creators out there are doing, they're building communities and they're realizing that you can scale basic advice pretty easily if you have a community and an engagement that doesn't require them to manage paperwork or manage assets because that's a burden, but allows them to give advice. And actually presents a real problem because this is an area that regulation is still trying to figure out. And I think a lot of people in the industry, outside the industry, regulators, government have realized there might be something here. We don't know if regulation is currently set up to properly either grow this potential new model of business or to stifle it. And the short answer is I don't think there is a good solution out there right now.
Yay. I wish we could have some more positive answers, but I think one of the things that I learned in speaking with you is that I think you're one of the people who's asking the right questions, and I think that's, important of and by itself. We're getting to the end, so I want to wrap this up with my usual things, which is beginning with that's bullshit. What is it? Is there anything in the industry that if you could have a magic wand and change one thing about the industry, anything that sticks in your craw, what would it be?
Yeah, I mean, this is informed from my research, but also just the way things have been going. And that is portfolio management is basically, if not already commoditized, approaching commoditization. And I think the advice proposition needs to shift away from portfolio centricity and either closer towards planning centricity or people centricity. And I say that because if you focus on the person and what they need and understand that everyone is individual, they have their own goals, people are very different. If you understand the person, you can create a better plan, whether it's comprehensive, light, whatever it is. And once you do that, the product stuff, like the portfolios, that is almost secondary, especially when you're younger with not a lot of assets. Probably the far biggest determinant of how much you're going to have is your savings rate, not how perfect your
Right.
portfolio is, anyways.
Right.
So getting that lift off for, the mass market and younger consumers, that would be my wish list is to, if I could wave a wand, have, industry or business models develop that get away from portfolio centricity and get more to either person or planning centricity.
Which then brings us to shift happens. If it was up to Preet Banerjee, what would you do to change to get portfolios to move toward personal or planning centricity and away from the seemingly commoditized and homogenized portfolio management aspect?
You got to find a way to sever the incentives. So all the incentives, predominantly, I would say all, but predominantly, all the incentives are aligned towards asset management and asset gathering assets. And I would say that the need for advice is, people need help in setting and establishing the goals, creating strategies to achieve those goals, monitoring and review. So incentives that are aligned with planning and planning based outcomes, as opposed to assets under management, would be a big step. But I'm not holding my breath that that's going to be changing anytime
Right.
soon.
Yeah, I think one of the problems is that if you think of the Freakonomics books, Levitt and Dubner will say people respond to incentives, and I think you're right. If we could find a way to put incentives in place, the good news is people will respond. The question is, how do we put incentives in place? Because the industry is being compensated, as far as I can tell, and as far as I can see looking forward, based on assets. And as a result, unless you could actually perhaps have a maybe a lower asset fee with a higher add-on fee for services rendered, maybe a hybrid model where instead of paying 1.25% for assets under management, you pay 1% for assets, but anywhere from 0 to 1/2 of 1% for other deliverables that are more humanistic. And in the end, uh, the total cost to the client might not be materially different, but the outcome could be more efficacious, and that's a win-win for the industry.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we toss around numbers like that, when you look at people who don't have a lot of assets, even a 1.5% when you've got less than 10 grand, it's not a lot. If you're getting planning and someone to change your behavior, that kind of makes sense. Uh, is the model where people pay by the hour, like they pay an accountant? Is that a model that'll grow? I think there's no one perfect solution. I think with any compensation model, there are pros and cons. And I think one of the challenges is acknowledging that, there's gonna be some people who can do a lot of the investing, heavy lifting on their own, that's fine, but where do they go and get all the other services as well? So that compartmentalization and incentivizing different types of advice, offerings, that's a really difficult nut to crack, and, we could spend hours talking about that,
Yeah.
and I'm sure we will, offline, but, yeah, I have unfortunately no good practical solutions that will see the light of day in the next little while.
Well, I want to thank you despite that because, as I say, a lot of coming up with good solutions requires that we ask the right questions. And one of the things that's great about you is that you ask meaningful, purposeful questions that can hopefully move the ball forward if we turn our attention to them. And there may be, given advances in AI and whatnot, that we can maybe have cyborg solutions that are able to help people do their behavioral coaching, where you can talk to a human if you have a personal question, but there might be sort of generic things that you can do without that. It's to be determined, but I remain hopeful. Hopefully, I'm not a blind-eyed optimist because I talk about the bias of optimism being dangerous if you take it too far. But I think this is one area where we can make some positive contributions down the road, and I think the future still is a bit quite bright for the industry.
Yeah, and in the meantime, I think with, I hope some of the findings of my research and other research that's been done, in the meantime, I hope people can use that to get the most value out of whatever relationships that they have, or to maybe look at different types of relationships with the financial services. So while we may not have the answers for what would be the perfect sort of utopia, in the meantime, I think we can help and continue to help consumers make better choices so that they at least they are getting the most value that they can.
Perfect. Let's end there. Preet, thank you so much. I'm so glad you could join me today.
My pleasure, John. Thank you.
John DeGooey is a portfolio manager in Toronto and the author of the book Bullshift: How Optimism Bias Threatens Your Finances. Bullshift is available online and in bookstores everywhere. The opinions expressed in this podcast should not be construed as investment advice. Bullshift, the podcast, is produced by TalkShoe, a division of IOTM.